Hi, and welcome to week 6 of our Old Testament class. This week we're going to be talking about the Old Testament prophets. That's why I've chosen as the backdrop for our slides for this week this picture, as painted by Michelangelo, of the prophet Isaiah receiving his message from God. This is what he painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in Rome. Let's talk first about the role of a prophet. Actually, the role of a prophet changes throughout the Old Testament. In the early days, in the pre-monarchy, before the kings, the prophet was a spokesperson for God, but this would also be combined with a leader of the people. So Moses or Deborah, for example, are considered both leaders and prophets. And the audience for this time period was primarily to the people. But then as we move closer into the monarchy, we find that the role of the prophet changes. Now the prophet becomes an advisor to the king or to the court, such as Nathan or Elisha or Elijah. The audience is not the people in general, but the king in particular. The message could be military counsel, how to lead the army, what to do, what strategies to follow, warnings, pointing out to the king something that they should be careful about, blessings, such as when Nathan comes to David and announces God's intention to create a dynasty from him, or judgments, as when Nathan comes to David and condemns him for the murder of Uriah. Then as we move into the later monarchy, the role changes once again. Now, it's not addressed primarily to the king, but back again to the people. The prophet is really a commentator, giving God's opinion about what's happening in the present. The message could be a call for repentance from sin, and again, the two sins that the prophets most focus on are idolatry and oppression. A love for God that was missing, or a love for the people that was missing. If the people didn't change their ways, the prophets would send them warnings. And if the people were doing the right thing, then the prophets spoke words of blessing. There are three groups of these, what we call classical or writing prophets. The first group, in the 8th to the 7th centuries, that would be the 700s and 600s, are listed there. The ones with question marks were just not sure when they wrote. They seem to fit during this time period. Then moving forward into the early 6th century, that would be the early years of the 500s, you have prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Habakkuk, and then you have the period of the exile. In the post-exilic period, after 538, the late 6th and on into about 400 BC, are the minor prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. In these classical or writing prophets, we're talking about men or women. Yes, there were women prophets. Now, we don't have the writings of those prophets, but we do know of women prophets, like Huldah, who spoke during this time period. They are called by God to be his spokespersons. They're called to guide God's people in troubled times. They're really a combination of press secretary and ambassador. A press secretary doesn't give his or her own words, they give the words of the person they're representing. Press secretary for the president. We don't care what he thinks. We want to know what the president thinks. Combined with that, you have the ambassador, the one who really represents the president in a foreign land. Put those two things together, and you really have the role of a prophet in this classical or writing prophets period. They've been called covenant enforcement mediators. Remember, God had a covenant with his people. They weren't keeping their end of the bargain, and he sends the prophets to bring the people back, to mediate on his behalf, to bring the people back into compliance. The prophets guide God's people primarily by forthtelling, announcing a message from God. Now, in order to do that, there's an element of prediction or foretelling, but that's not the primary purpose for a prophet, contrary to what we ordinarily think. The prophets are not primarily about predicting the future. They're primarily about announcing God's judgment on the present, that is, the present for the prophet's day. And they speak in oracles or messages from God. How they receive those messages? Well, there are a variety of ways. It could be through visions, as in Isaiah 6, where Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up in the temple. It could be through a voice, an audible voice, as in Numbers 12:8. It could be through another prophet, where, as in 2 Kings 9, God gives the message to prophet A, whose job it is to communicate it to prophet B. It could be through dreams, as in Jeremiah 31, or even through music. In this passage in 2 Kings 3:15, the prophet wants a message from God, so he summons a musician who plays the harp, and the message is received. Sometimes God sends this message through angels, as he often does in Daniel. And sometimes the message comes with an ecstatic experience, almost like the prophet is taken over by another spirit and behaves in strange ways. Now, here are several things I want you to remember as you're reading the prophets. These are elaborated on in that chapter early on in the book where it talks about the Bible as a library. But let me just go over them again for you. First, remember these messages are addressed to the original audience. So you've got to understand them as the original audience would have understood them. Put your ancient Near Eastern glasses on. Second, know the historical context. The more you understand of that, the easier time you'll have with the prophets. A good study Bible will help you here. Third, handle the metaphor carefully. The prophets use lots of word pictures. Just be careful not to press an over-literal meaning on those metaphors. That's not what the author intended. Fourth, don't read the prophecies to determine our future. I know that's commonly the way they're treated, but that's not what God intends. I'm sure of that. So read the prophets primarily to determine what God was saying to the original audience. Now, we can learn from what God was saying about God and God's plan, as I point out later, but the primary message that you're after first is what it meant to the original audience. Next, read these predictions from what I'm calling a prophetic perspective. So, what is that? Well, picture yourself driving toward the Rocky Mountains. You're driving from the east toward the west, and you see these Rocky Mountains in the distance. Now, what you see the Front Range, where Denver is, and behind it you see the high Rocky Mountains. Now, how much distance is there between the Front Range and the high mountains? Well, you don't know. You can't tell from that perspective. That's the prophetic perspective. The prophets are not interested in telling us how much time elapses between what's going on in the prophet's day and when God is predicting something else to happen as a result. The prophet's not interested in telling us how much time elapses between what's going on in their own day and when God acts. He's concerned to connect what's happening in the present, their present, with what God will do. That's the focus that you want to pursue as you're reading this material. Also remember that sometimes these prophetic passages can have a double fulfillment. We can't rule that out. But as I said, read these for what they say about God and God's plan. All right, this is week 6, just 2 more weeks to go. Thanks for the great job that you're doing. Remember to post early in the week so that others have a chance to respond to something. And remember that as you're commenting on these things, more than just an I agree, press in a little bit, maybe ask a follow-up question. Thanks so much for the great job that you're doing. Have a great week.